So hopefully you know that you're in the right presentation. We'll be talking about UX testing methods and how you go about presenting your findings. My name is Danielle Sheffler. I work at New Target, and if you want to tweet during the session, that's my Twitter handle. I am a PM and usability lead at New Target, and both a PMP as well as a certified usability analyst through Human Factors. So in terms of who is New Target, we are in Alexandria, Virginia, so not too far away. And we do kind of everything with the web. So we're not just a development shop. We really work with strategy, not just usability, but helping companies find a vision, figure out their goals, really determine where they're going. And we also do design, development, hosting, as well as marketing. So since we're talking about usability, we should probably talk about what usability is first, right? So usability is how easy it is to use and learn any type of user interface. So we're here to talk about Drupal, so it probably means that you're working with a website. But when I say any user interface, I'll give you an example. So who has ever gone and looked at a flat panel on a door and tried to push and then felt like an idiot because you were really supposed to pull? Yeah, okay, it's happened to a lot of us, right? Bad usability. So that's what I mean in terms of a user interface. It's not necessarily with a product or site, it's things even in the real world outside of the computer. So the other things when we're talking about usability, we have pretty much 5 main areas that we look at. So we look at the learnability of a system. What that means is we're looking at how easy it is to learn a website. And really, you shouldn't have to learn a website too much. You should be able to go figure out what you want to do right away. And that's really how you're going to gauge how usable your product is, making sure that people don't really have to learn too much on that site. We look at how efficient it is to get to what you're trying to do. So do you really want people, if they're trying to buy a product, to have to click into 10 different things? Probably not. You want it to be simple and easy to use. In terms of memorability, that pretty much goes hand in hand with learning. If your user goes to your site and they have to try to figure out after 5, 6, 7, 8 times how to use that site, probably means that there's something wrong and that you need to change that path or something specific within the site. In terms of errors, we'd all love to pretend that the sites that we build or that we use don't have errors, right? That would be fantastic if there was never anything wrong. It's not really going to be the case in most instances. Obviously, you want to try to minimize those errors, as well as making sure that when people do encounter an error, it's really easy to recover from it. So, if you have forms, make sure that there are really clear user messages so that you don't just see something come up on the screen that says, you can't fill in this form, and the user sitting there going, okay, but what's wrong? Really not sure. Just make that clear to them. And then the last piece, sometimes it's not as easy to do, but just making sure that the user perception is good. Now, every user is different, so you could have a perfect website, and it could still be difficult to get somebody to perceive it as being great, depending on what their needs are. But it is very important to make sure that the user is satisfied. So what types of tests exist? So this is what we're going to go through. Anybody who is a true usability practitioner will probably say, but no, Danielle, the first 5 or so aren't actually considered usability tests. Those are more considered your user-centered design and your research. But at the same time, they're still important. They still really get us to be able to gather important information. I'm obviously not talking about every test under the sun because we only have about 45 minutes. Believe me, if you know me and you've talked to me, I could seriously sit up here for hours and hours and hours and talk about all of this. So in terms of one-click testing and eye tracking and some other tests, those aren't all up here. But in terms of what we'll be talking about today, this is really where we're going to focus. So the first piece that we'll talk about is I mentioned user-centered design. So what is user-centered design and what is usability? So if any of you were here last year, you heard me give an entire presentation on user-centered design. And just in terms of 3 or 4 words, it's basically data gathering, doing that analysis, really doing a lot of research before you've built anything that's fully fleshed out in terms of a design or development. You're just doing your basic research. Whereas in terms of your usability testing, you're working with an existing design. Now that existing design really may be a paper prototype. It might be a prototype that you have online, but it is something where you can have measurable criteria in terms of how people look at a particular instance, how they look at a call to action, how they like a particular design that you can actually use with statistics. So the first test that we're talking about is a heuristic evaluation, which I think of everything that I have mentioned, maybe the one that people are the least familiar with. A heuristic evaluation is basically looking at a checklist of a kind of laundry list almost of components. So I only have about 5 or 6 listed up here. The amount that's on that checklist is really about 10 to 12. It's really not just looking at some of the usability pieces that I talked about before, but it is also looking at consistency and standards, really making sure that could be HTML standards, it could be CSS standards, it could be looking at standards related to the actual industry, focusing on help and documentation. So this really takes the form of a long checklist that a usability practitioner would go through on an existing site. So in terms of the good things about heuristic evaluations is you only need one person, which is your usability practitioner. And so it's pretty fast, it's pretty inexpensive compared to a lot of the other tests that you would do, and it's pretty easy to determine fixes because this is an example of what we would go through with the checklist. This is what I mean, like that one piece with 15 is just one section of what I had, but you can tell that there's a rating scale, there are comments, so it's pretty easy to determine exactly what fix that you would want to make because everything's laid out right there in a checklist, and it's not really something where you're looking at, you know, talking to 10 different people and trying to grab what that fix might be. The bad thing, though, is that you need a usability practitioner. So if there's not somebody who's qualified, you may have to go out and find that person because you're looking for someone that has that expertise of what should be in that checklist. How exactly do I evaluate things correctly? It is sometimes hard to say because obviously you want to do usability, but it's kind of like design and development. Do you want to design and develop something because you read something off the internet and think that you could do it? For any designers and developers in the room, I'm sure you'd say no. You want to make sure that you have someone who's going to be doing it right. And so you need to have the right person doing this. The other piece, though, is that you need to make sure that you have somebody that has the technical expertise because you're talking about making fixes. So if there's something that's broken on the site, and say we're talking about Drupal, and maybe it's related to a module, I personally don't build modules. So if I'm going to have a fix in place, I need to make sure that I know what I'm talking about. So when I give it to a designer, I give it to a developer, I'm giving them the right information. So you may have to go and talk to someone else and making sure that you're suggesting the right things. So in terms of the tools, it is, like I said, pretty fast and inexpensive because you just need a practitioner and you just need the checklist. There are actually checklists online as well as samples if you need any. So the next piece is surveys, which I'm sure a lot of people are very familiar with. It's one of the most common ways to do quick testing because you can survey a lot of people at once. You just need a tool like SurveyMonkey, Question Pro, Zoomerang. There are survey modules that you can go and use that are in Drupal. So in terms of actually finding something, it's pretty easy to find a tool. So again, these are pretty, fast and expensive. There are a lot of examples out there in terms of what to do with templates. Again, you have to make sure that you know that you're asking the right questions. You need to make sure that you understand what the user goals are. You need to understand what you're looking for. If you're asking about a certain piece of functionality, but 95% of users say that it works well and they don't want you to touch it, do you really want to be using survey questions that ask about that information? Probably not. So you just really need to focus on that. The one thing that you do need to be careful about with surveys is that a lot of times people aren't going to be using your survey or filling out your survey and looking at your site on the other screen. So they're going to be focusing a lot on memory and sometimes even on preference and not actually what they do. And so you have to be careful that you're getting the right data. And so when you look at this, you just kind of have to make sure that you realize that your data, while it is good to get data, may not be 100% accurate. The other thing to make sure of is that you may have 4 or 5 different target audiences, but at the same time, you also need to make sure that you're getting a good representative sample of those target audiences. If you're trying to get 4 or 5 audiences and you have, say, 100 from one target audience and 5 responses from another, then it's going to be a little bit difficult to say, okay, I got accurate data from this one that has, 5 people that responded to it. So just being careful. The other thing is it's very difficult, obviously, to follow up with people if you don't have anything at the end of your survey that says, can we please contact you? So that's one way to get around that, though, is to ask, and have a field out there that says, are you willing to have someone contact you to follow up? Because a lot of times if you have open-ended questions, you get some really interesting responses, and so you want to be able to ask people about what they said. So the next piece is interviews. So this is generally when you have, 2 people in a room interviewing one person, and I say that because you need both an interviewer and you need a note taker too. If I'm interviewing someone, then I need to make sure that I'm focused on what that person is saying, and then I'm not scribbling down notes at the same time. You can absolutely do it. It's just harder to kind of do it all at once, and it's good to have one person who's focused on every single thing the person is saying to make sure that you can pull quotes, etc., for when you're presenting that information at the end. Sometimes the hard thing is that it can be costly and take more time just because you actually have to recruit people. Sometimes you may be doing this internally. We've definitely done that where we're interviewing stakeholders, and so it's kind of decided for us. So it's not really much recruiting time, but if you're looking for users in order to do this, that can cost a little bit more. The other thing is you need to make sure that you have someone that can anticipate those important topics. So unlike a survey where here's the question, here's the responses, that's all you get, someone may say something really, really interesting that just grabs your attention and that you had never heard before and just a really exciting insight. And you need to make sure that you know how to follow up with that. So you need to make sure that you have someone who's qualified, who knows how to ask those correct questions. And again, it is great with these interviews because you're able to follow up. So the next piece is card sorting. Some people really like card sorting. Some people really don't like card sorting. And the reason why is you're helping to put that information architecture, that navigation, those logical relationships in the hands of your users. So that may be, there are so many different ways to do this. You can see that there are actually websites that allow you to do it. There have been times where we really didn't have a big budget in companies I've worked with in the past too, where basically you are using a PowerPoint and you put cards on there and send it out to someone, and that's how you're doing your card sorting. So I'm actually going to step back and talk about what card sorting is because I realize not everybody may know what it is. So there are 2 ways to do card sorting generally, card sorting and reverse card sorting. And basically in either method, you are either coming up with groupings, say for your top level navigation, and terms that may be under those elements, and you're spreading out those cards for the sub-navigation and telling users, put these where you think it should go. Or sometimes you already know what's in that second level navigation, and you tell them, name the top level navigation. And that's what I said, it is basically having people figure out what those logical relationships are. Sometimes it's very helpful. There may be disagreements between what's going on in terms of inside your team or with the client or something like that, where this is extremely helpful. There have been times when I've helped with card sorting and we've had people fill things out, and say if you have 10 people, that you have 8 different responses. So it's kind of like, okay, well, what do I do then and how do I follow up? So you just have to be aware that sometimes that information that you get can be very scattered and that it may be difficult to do some of that analysis. All right, so focus groups. Actually kind of a controversial topic. So the thing with focus groups is that they can be really, really good at the start of a project. Once you've recruited participants, they are actually pretty fast, and it's a really inexpensive way to do testing. Because, for example, if we're doing moderated and unmoderated testing, which we'll talk about later, say even if you only have 10 participants, you're still dealing with 10 different tests. Where if in a focus group where you have 8 to 10 people in one room, you're getting that information all at one time. And so you're able to get as much data as possible in, say, 1 or 2 hours. The bad thing about focus groups is that you have to make sure that you have the right mix of people, I guess I should say. Because you get this concept called mob mentality, where one person may say something and almost try to get like everybody else on their side. They want to be right. They want to feel like they're the ones that have the best idea and that everybody needs to agree with them. Or it may be the case where someone says something and the other people are afraid to disagree, and so you don't always get all of the ideas that are out there. So you just need to make sure that you have someone too who's really able to say, like, okay, that's a great idea, but at the same time, Mary, what do you think? Make sure that you have someone to draw out that information, because otherwise you do risk having 1 or 2 people have all of the ideas and the other ideas not being heard. The other thing is that talking about something is different than actually doing it. I apologize for those of you if you actually remember this example from last year, but there was a concept, there was a car called the Edsel, and that was actually designed primarily through a focus group. And so people said, I want this, 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 and this in my car, and it's going to be the best car. I'm so excited to be part of a focus group for a car. They built the car that was based off of user feedback, and it sold miserably. Because once people actually saw what it was like to have all of those components in a car together, they were kind of like, this is terrible. We don't want this at all. So I'm not trying to say that happens in every focus group. Just remember that when you're talking about something, that it is different than if you actually have a user using that website or whatever you're testing. The other thing, I put up this comic just because of the fact that, again, sometimes people will say that they really want things, but you may not be able to do it. I mean, if this is a company, I'm sure that everybody in this room would probably love a promotion, or if you're building a product, you'd love to do it cheaper. But at the same time, is that always possible? Not really. So again, keeping some of those things in mind. So the next concept, I actually kind of put 2 in 1, is A/B testing and comparative evaluation. So A/B testing, as some of you may know, is basically taking, say, the same page of a site. So if you have a home page, and you want to test the difference between calls to action. So, for example, we work with a lot of associations. So is it better on one particular website to have a graphic that, represents that donate option, or is it better to have a button? What's going to work for the user? And so we may have 2 different home pages that we would show to the user and see which one that they like better. A comparative evaluation is actually having a user go do a task on your prototype or your site, and then also trying to do it on a competitor's site. So for example, and don't laugh because I know Google Plus didn't exactly take off, but it would almost be something like, having a user do something, say, in Facebook, and then having them do it in Google Plus, and seeing what the difference would be between, say, putting up a new status and seeing what users like better, what works better, and really figuring out what functionality that you would want. So in terms of A/B testing, it's great because you can determine what items you need to change. Does the navigation work better on A or B? Does that donate button as a graphic work better on A than as a button on B? So you can really see how this looks, and you want to make sure to do this early in your design so that you know what should be in your design. As anybody who knows who has done testing, after things are already done. Great to do testing, really, really expensive to go change your whole design. If it's one element, not so bad, but again, really want to make sure that you're not changing 4 or 5 things and going back. I don't want to say bad thing about A/B testing, but one of the things that can happen is if you try to change too many elements at one time. I mean, obviously the point is, do you want A or do you want B? And you don't really want to have people say, oh, I kind of like all this stuff in A, and then I want this certain stuff in B. The goal is to have an either or. And so if you're changing colors and navigation and buttons versus graphics and all of these other things, it's really not an either or. You're really making it so that the user has to pick options from both. The other thing is you need to make sure, and this is true for all of these, that you know the user goals. Because, for example, kind of what I said before with the surveys, you don't want to have questions where you already know that 95% of the people like the way that something works and then ask about it and kind of waste one of those survey questions. Again, if you know that people really have been donating a lot of money by using that graphic and they've said that a button would be too small or it's not as obvious, is that really how you want to use that A/B testing? You really need to think about what it is that you're trying to do. Same thing with your comparative evaluation. So all of us work in, maybe in agencies and government, etc. I may not look at a website for the government in one agency, and then if we pretend that another government agency was a competitor, go have someone do something else in that different website if the goals aren't the same. So you just really need to think about what you're trying to do. So the next piece is moderated testing. The first thing I want to say about moderated testing is that some people think moderated testing means that you absolutely have to have a really nice lab and you have to, have glass and all the people there and everything else. You can absolutely do remote moderated testing. We do it a lot, actually, using GoToMeeting. I just want to make sure that people don't think that you need a lot of fancy equipment in order to get it done. So that's really the first thing about moderated testing is you can just do it with website open, GoToMeeting. It can be pretty easy to actually set up. The great thing is you can get immediate feedback from your user. So you don't have to worry and wait 2 weeks for a survey to close. You don't have to worry about, really having any time in terms of between when you start the test and when it ends. Within that 45 minutes to an hour, you can get a lot of work done and cover a lot of ground and figure out exactly what a user is experiencing, what they like, what they don't like, how they navigate through a site. And the other part too is with moderated testing, whether or not you're doing this remote or whether or not that it's in person, you can really make sure that you ask complicated scenarios or multi-part questions. You obviously want to word them in the correct way, but it's a lot easier to do that than in some other instances. So you can, have someone answering a question about navigation, then take them through 2 or 3 other paths related to that. Pretty quick and easy for them to do that. The bad thing is that depending on what you're testing, for example, especially if you're testing a prototype, users really get stuck on a design. And so even if you start out by saying this is a prototype, it's black and white, it's not actually how the site will function, you need to make sure that you remind users of that over and over and over again. I don't know how many people have had this actually happen, but even though I've started out with that and then said it again in the middle of the test, I've still had people, when I ask at the end, what did you not like about this site or this design? They say, well, there are no colors. And you kind of want to just do like this because it's like, well, I already said that, there are no colors. It's a prototype. People get really stuck, or, they could have loved the entire site, but if they didn't like that the navigation bar is blue, you may only hear about how the navigation bar was blue. So just go in with that expectation, basically, that users may get stuck on certain things. And so you do need to just be careful, make sure that you have a way to kind of guide them out of that. You also do need to make sure that you have someone, again, that is experienced in this. Now, that may seem a little odd because, I'm just asking questions about my site. This should be pretty easy. Can I just, download something and go? The thing with moderated and unmoderated testing is it's very easy to kind of lead users in a direction and not realize it. So they may say, is this how it's supposed to work? And if you say, well, no, or, something else, or, well, yes, then you've kind of led the user to think, is this right or is this wrong? And you don't, in a way, care about whether or not they think it's right or wrong. I mean, you do. I don't want to say that you don't care, but, depending on that, you don't want them to know if it's right or wrong, basically, is what it comes down to. You want to make sure that you just get their opinion. And so you have to make sure that you have someone that says, I don't know, do you think this is the right way? What do you think? And kind of throw it back at them so that you're not leading them kind of down that path. So in terms of tools, like I said, you don't necessarily need anything fancy, just a quiet room. When I do GoToMeeting, I try to make sure I'm someplace where I'm not going to be interrupted, so don't have a lot of background noise. Again, even if it's remote, having a moderator and a note taker so you have someone to get those quotes right on the fly, make sure that everything's written down is great. Also a recording device, again on GoToMeeting, you can record that right away. Doesn't have to be, through a video camera, just having the sound is helpful to go back. And also for GoToMeeting, Moray is another tool. The good thing about Moray is the software is amazing. It's a little expensive, so if you're doing a lot of usability testing, it's good. The other thing is it also has to be downloaded onto a PC, though. So it's technically, I guess you could do remote testing, but it would almost be like you have to have it downloaded on a PC and then GoToMeeting for someone to hook in. So it's a little bit more complicated. I will say in terms of in-person testing that it is good in a way just because you can get people's facial expressions. And obviously, if you're remote, you may be able to hear the inflection in their voice. Or if, sometimes I've heard people when they're not sure what to do, you get this like, and so you're like, okay, they're frustrated. Like, I know they're frustrated, but you can't always see it on their face. So in terms of unmoderated testing, these are two of the big tools that are out there. We usually use Open Hallway because you're able to record and you can, put everything on the screen for the user. The great thing is users can do this on their own time. So if they wanted to go in and they work until 11 at night, that's great because they can go and do the test at 11 at night if they want to. It is a little bit less expensive because as the moderator, you may have to go back and listen to that test. But I can tell you from experience that when we do moderated testing, we do the test session, but then we usually end up going back and listening to most of the test again anyway. So this somewhat puts your work in half, not always. The other problem is that you can't necessarily follow up with users. Again, you may be able to do that kind of on the back end after you've listened to the test, but it's not immediate. They may not even remember what they were trying to let you know, and so that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing as well is that you have to be very, very, very careful about how you write out your directions, because if you're doing moderated testing and someone's not 100% sure, you're there to clarify. If for some reason they don't understand the question as you've had it written out, there's no one there to help them and give them guidance. So you just have to make sure that you're being very, very clear with what you're trying to say. All right, so the next piece is how do you know of everything I've talked about, what you should use on your project? So I don't know about everybody else, but when someone gives me the word "it depends," I really, really don't like it. Well, guess what? It depends. It really does depend on several things. It depends on, say, if you're working in an agency or in another environment where you have a client that you're working with. I would love to do all of these tests plus some because it's what I'm passionate about, and I think, well, okay, it might be ridiculous to do all of those tests, but I'd like to do a combination of some of those tests because all of them provide great information. But if a client isn't necessarily paying you for that, you can't always go and do it. So it's basically some of the budget. Some of it depends on time, because really if you have a project, even if you're just doing the front end of the piece, and not even design or development, like requirements gathering and maybe delivering wireframes and that's it, then you don't want to tell the client, okay, well this might take us 4 or 5 months if it's supposed to be a simple project. So some of it may depend on time as well. The other is also if you have to do any recruiting, you need to make sure that there's time built in for that and that you have someone who's qualified to help with recruiting. So in terms of what tests to use, you definitely need something that will help you determine what the user goals are. So you would want either surveys, interviews, something along those lines. If you really don't have a lot of time at all, doing that heuristic evaluation, so at least you have a checklist to work off of, is great. Really just trying to figure out what you want. In terms of usability testing, I'm a huge proponent of it. I'm a huge proponent of it really at a certain point. Again, like I said, you can do usability testing once your entire site is built. Very expensive. I'm going to keep saying that. It is very, very, very expensive to do that. So I would advise against that. Some people do it kind of as like a last double check, I guess I should say. So they'll do it when they have a built out prototype that they know this is what we're planning on developing against, and make changes. And then once they're pretty sure that that's about like 98% of the way there, then they'll go build it out and then do some final testing and do like a second phase of their project. So that works as well. But I would definitely say pick 1 or 2 from that first piece and then do some usability testing. So the next part goes into actually presenting your findings. So you obviously need to, after you've done your research and after you've done your testing, I'm guessing somebody probably wants to see it, right? So there are a few things that you need to think about. The first piece is, who is your target audience? Who are you actually delivering this to? And it may be delivering to several different people, and you may actually need it to be in several different formats depending on who that audience is. The next piece goes right hand in hand with that format. And of course, depending on what the format is, it depends on what you want to include and how much detail you need to go into. So in terms of your target audiences, these are just some of the audiences that we've seen. So if you're presenting, say, to a CEO of a client or something like that, even if it's a really small company, my guess is that the CEO does not have time to read through like a really thorough 50-page report. If they do, I would love to know who that CEO is, because that's amazing that they fit time to be able to read a usability report. Now that depends. If they're the usability champion for the project, then sure, that may actually be the case that they want to read that, but probably not going to be the case. When I say client on a peer level, so sometimes we work with developers, sometimes we work with project managers, a designer, even someone who's in UX kind of on the client side. And so when I say peer level, I think of them as being someone who, if they worked with you at your company, that they would kind of be on your level. And then your team members. So I would think that your team members may actually want to see what you're doing. So if I went and tested a prototype and then I just do a usability report and I hand it off to our developers, well, they'll probably be like, well, Danielle, you didn't suggest maybe what we wanted to suggest. So need to have a report that actually incorporates their feedback, first of all, but is in a readable format for them to maybe give suggestions and to help with the design and development process. So next you have to think about your format. And of course, this depends on the type of tests that you're doing. So if you're using something like Moray for usability testing, then you have video clips probably. Again, if you're not doing a crazy remote, trying to do that with Moray, you probably had somebody sitting there. Or if you're doing, some other type of testing, and so focus groups, sometimes people record that with a camera, making sure that you have those video clips. I can tell you that visually, that information is very powerful, because, I haven't had this happen, but I could see somebody saying, like, are you sure you wrote that quote down or, correctly, or Are you sure that's what they meant? If you have someone looking at this and saying, I can't use this, or, this design, it just is not working for me, yeah, okay, like you can't really argue if you have a clip or, a recording of somebody saying that. So having that piece there. Graphs and charts, whether or not it's from a survey, whether or not it is, again, from something like Moray or something that you've even created yourself from getting your usability testing together and going through and making charts and graphs of what users are saying, extremely important. In terms of presentations, you could do a Prezi or a PowerPoint, PDF, something like that. Pretty quick, pretty easy. Again, this is something that you may want to use if you're looking at that CEO level, that executive level person who really doesn't have a lot of time. One thing that is really helpful to do in that case, because obviously, you may have a lot of data and a lot of really rich data that you want to get across. But one thing that's helpful in those cases is just like the 3 most important findings or the 3 most surprising things, or any like top 3 list is really going to be helpful in terms of getting someone to figure out what really was the shocking piece or the important piece as you were testing, and really kind of conveying to the reason behind testing as well, because we'd all like to pretend that everybody understands the need for usability. Unfortunately, not always the case, so having some of those findings helpful as well. You can do a report. We've definitely done reports that have been, 30 to 50 pages because we had clients that really wanted all that information, and in order to get that information across, they had to be in reports. If you're, for example, looking at a government site that has, thousands of pages, trying to just deliver a short report of the top 3 things is probably not going to get all of the information across that you need. And the last piece is supplemental information. So what do I mean by that? I mean that if you are talking about a heuristic evaluation, you may want to show what that checklist looked like. You may want to show what were those survey questions or interview questions. If you're doing testing, moderated testing or unmoderated testing, that supplemental information can sometimes be really, really thick, because someone may want to know, what did that screener look like when you were recruiting participants? What did those test scripts look like? What was the test plan? What were the questions? A lot of times I actually create a script for myself, since I'm the moderator and I'm reading it to someone, and then I actually have a note taker script, because they'll be circling, what was the severity of the problem, here's where all the notes could go, here are great quotes, that I may, have some space for, but since I'm moderating and I'm focusing on the actual user at that point and asking those questions, that I don't have in my script. So the last piece is, what do you include? So we talked about the different formats, and again, if you're working with a client, you may have that, top 3 presentation, and you may have that nice report for them. Obviously, you want details, and in those video clips we were talking about that as well. But some of the really important things, other than those summaries and really explaining things, is making sure that you have statistics. Like, which is more powerful? 75% of our users did this versus a lot of the people we tested. Okay, what is a lot? Is that 4 out of 5? Is that like 2.5 out of 5? Like, what does that look like? So really making sure that those are there. The thing about statistics, though, is making sure that you explain them. And that may seem a little silly because they're a statistic, don't they speak for themselves? But you may have a site, and you're doing the evaluation, you're still the expert. So if 75% of the people said that they used this link up in the top right corner to get to a section, it may be, say if you're testing an existing site, before you go and do the redesign in this case, that may be the only link that's available to the user to get to that information. Or the site's just really bad and they can't find where the right link is. So even though 75% of the people go there, you need to make sure that you're adding in your own analysis to say, this is 75%, but I don't think it's right. And here's the reason why. And so making sure that you're including those explanations. The other piece are your rating scales, or sometimes people call them severity scales. Now, I wish that I could say that all usability practitioners agree and we have this like nice list of this is what the rating is. Crazy enough, not always. And there is a reason for this though. So a lot of people say that 1, so like the really serious piece, is if a page is broken, right, that it would be a 1, which makes sense. I mean, it's a broken page. If you can't get to it, that's a problem. But if you found out that literally only 2% of your users go there, and yet you have another problem where, say, the CSS is completely broken on a page and items are all over the place, and 90% of your users are looking at that page, which one are you going to prioritize, and which one is more severe? So sometimes you won't know that information until after you've actually created that scale, and so you do have to make sure that you're a little bit flexible, making sure to explain that. I mean, if you just say like, this is on the severity scale of 1, that might not mean something to somebody, but if you say, we realize this piece was broken, but this was also broken and more people use it, then having that explanation is very helpful. Again, screenshots are very helpful as well. So again, in GoToMeeting, in Moray, even if you have a paper prototype and you literally take a picture of it with your camera and put that in your presentation, and then go in and circle things maybe where something was wrong, and having that information written on the screenshot, also very helpful because it's visual for someone to see. You may be talking about the button that is extremely obvious, but why not take the extra 2 minutes and actually create like a box or something around that with an arrow of this is exactly where I'm talking about, so there's no question as to where the issue is. And I mean, that's, I guess the other thing I didn't talk about format. So we talked about reports. So sometimes we do them in Word documents. Again, it doesn't have to be a traditional Word document. It can be, a really nice, pretty PDF. You may sometimes want to talk to your client about what you think they need. There have been times when, sometimes they've said, this is the format that we absolutely have to have. But sometimes you may want to be a little bit more creative in how you're presenting things. So again, like I said, I hate that it depends answer, but you really need to figure out kind of what works best for you in that situation. So I have been talking for 45 minutes. I think I am, ready for questions, and let's have at it. So actually, before we do that really quickly, just my Twitter handle, and then if you have any questions after the session as well, I'll be outside. I'll also be, New Target has a booth downstairs as well. Yes?
First of all, this is very inspiring, and I did some informal just hover on the shoulder test with clients last week, and it worked really well, so this is exciting. That client wants to use Optimizely. They believe Optimizely, A/B testing, to move things around on the page, on a couple key pages, is going to be the cat's meow, and it's going to tell us everything.
Okay.
Do you have an opinion on that?
I guess the question is that the only testing really, other than kind of the hover, and is that really all they're planning on doing?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, if that's the only thing, again, I hate using it depends, but it just comes in so many times. But, if that's kind of what they have budgeted for, because it's so quick and so easy, it can get the job done. I guess the thing is they need to, and you would need to verify as kind of the person working on the project, they really understand what the user's trying to do, and to make sure that all of those pieces are kind of in place. So, I mean, if they've already done testing or they know from feedback, so that's another thing, a lot of clients may have initial feedback from users, writing them, etc. If they know that their navigation's working well, the layout's been working well, the colors have been working well, and it's only like a few certain things, then I think, yes, A/B testing could get the job done. If they haven't done the due diligence or haven't had someone else prior to you do the due diligence, I would say they probably need to go a step further and do a bit more testing. Yes.
So I've had this scenario happen a couple times. I'm wondering if you've had it before and can tell me about it. So I've had users that go through a test and their behavior indicates that they're frustrated, that they fail a task or whatever, and then at the end they feel like, oh no, this was fine, this was an okay site, and I'm like, but you sat there and you were pulling your hair out. And so it's just like their words totally contradicted their behavior and also their ability to complete the task. And I'm wondering, how often does that happen? What do you do to deal with it?
I heard that question. Yes, it does happen. It does. And it is weird because you're like, you just acted like you hated this site, like what's going on. A lot of times what I'll do too, and I mean, maybe you've done this, so let me know. A lot of times in my initial script, I'll say, I was not the one to design this site. Like, I had nothing to do with the design. And so, you know what, say whatever you want to say. Like, be mean, tell me it's terrible, and then I joke and I say, you can also tell me that you really like it too, but just be honest. And so a lot of times I think sometimes the fear is that, when they're doing a task, like you'll know if they're doing it correctly or not, and so that may be where the frustration comes from, but they may be worried that they're insulting you or somebody else who's on the phone too, and so try to, kind of go back and be like, no, actually, like, loved it, great, and so they get worried.
The report.
Yeah.
Because then the report, it looks like everybody had no problem
Mm-hmm.
with it.
And don't be afraid either to kind of call them out on it. Obviously, like, not in a bad way, but, say, you know what, that's interesting that you said that, because it seemed like during, scenario XYZ, you seemed like you were really frustrated. So I just want to make sure, I'm writing this down correctly and actually getting your feelings. And then that might say, like, oh, yeah, that did happen. Because people are, like, really quick to forget some things sometimes, too. But, yeah, don't be afraid to call a user out on what they're saying. So,
Hi. So is there kind of an industry standard or acceptable level of failure? So I've done this where I'm presenting and I try to preface it. I'm like, okay, so it went really well. 80% of users did great, and the client looks at me and they're like, but that means that 20, higher education. They're like, that means that 20% of applicants are failing to apply, and it's like, well, no.
Yeah.
And then so I try to keep really good track of okay, if those 20% of those failures were all failing in the same way, then it would be one thing. But the fact that they're one-offs, is there just some type of documentation or something that I can be like, this is okay, because as you said in the beginning, not everything's perfect for everybody.
Yeah, it can be really hard. Even when you look at the other question that comes into play of how many people do you recruit and things like that, and they say if you have about 5 people, that'll uncover about 85% of the issues.
I usually aim for between 5 and 12.
Yeah, and it's hard because really there is, I've never seen a true standard. If anybody else has seen one, I'd love to hear it because I've done some research myself. Generally, in terms of uncovering the 85 to 90% of the problems, that's generally kind of where you go. But it is, there isn't always a hard and fast rule, because you're right, 80% is a good number.
Right.
And so, I hate to say no, not really, but I haven't been able to find anything yet, so.
Do you have any recommendations for acquiring testers or recruiting testers, and what do you consider a good base that would give you reliable results?
That's a great question. So a lot of times, and again, this really depends on where you're coming from in terms of if you're working as an agency with a client, or if you're kind of on your own for your own company. If you're working with an agency, if you're working with a client, a lot of times we ask them to help us. Now, we definitely give them guidelines. So we'll develop screeners. There are screeners online, but generally you want to, figure out, depending, again, on their age or on their gender or what they use the website for, really having that information. And so that's the first way to do it. Also, when I was saying at least 5 users, that's generally 5 users from each target audience. Now, hopefully you don't have 8 target audiences, and that actually might pose a problem because you may be trying to do a website for too many people, but definitely making sure that you have a nice mix. The other thing too is a lot of times you want to look for people who are maybe relatively new to the site or using the site versus people who are, kind of regular visitors, I guess I should say, because what they're seeing may be different too. Somebody who's been there for a long time may be very used to seeing what's on the site and how to use it, whereas somebody who's new may have more insights into, certain pieces. So, I don't know, did that answer your question?
Sure.
Okay. Anyone else? Yes.
What about paying people? Is that good or bad?
So, it's interesting because I feel like that is a big motivator to people. If they're like really unhappy with the site and they're kind of ambivalent, I have actually only been in one test of all the ones that I've done where we have paid people. Because a lot of times, if this is a main website for people, so for example, we work with a lot of associations too. If this is the main association for the work that you do, and you're finding it really hard to use, and that's where you get a lot of your information, you're probably going to be really motivated to help change that site without expecting anything else. So you really kind of have to gauge that user base and figure out if, this is my main source of information, definitely making sure that, they have that information. Then they probably won't care as much. If you feel like they do need something, even like a $5 Starbucks gift card, like you don't need to do anything super big either. So, all right, any other questions? Yes.
A lot of the user-centered design practices, that's what the assumption
Mhm.
seems rooted in the idea of diversity of audiences, kind of having a consistent experience. So different kinds of people using similar platforms. We've felt like lately it's almost the inverse, where the users are all kind of the same, but the platforms are other things as far as mobile and tablet and phone. What do you think about the idea? This has been happening a little bit with the agency. We're having sort of a full-time QA type person on the team that their whole job is knowing best practices and patterns and how human beings flourish on the web, as opposed to sort of treating each product as a totally new thing that's breaking ground and can't possibly be something that. I don't know if you've seen that at all.
Yeah, somewhat, and believe me, as my other hat as a PM, I would love to have a full-time QA person on staff. So yes.
Well, just think about this with pay. At some point, there's a cost benefit.
Yeah, the other thing too, and I went to a usability conference a few weeks ago that we were really talking too about, responsive versus just having a mobile site, and it actually isn't a bad thing to just have a mobile site depending on your user goals. I really think that's the most important thing. So some of the UCD stuff is really finding out like more of the user goals first. And then I feel like as you get into some more of that more complicated testing, that what you're saying definitely holds true. So, all right, I think we have time for maybe one more question, and then I'm sure everybody's hungry, so. All right. Okay, well, I think we're all set then, so thank you, everyone.